Finally, I want to thank and introduce our speaker, Miriam Posner. She is the Digital Humanities Program Director and a member of the core DH faculty at the University of California, Los Angeles. As a digital humanist, she is particularly interested in the visualization of large bodies of data from cultural heritage institutions and the application of digital methods to the analysis of images and videos. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Miriam.
Thank you. So can you hear me okay in the back? All our stuff comes up. Excellent. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is really exciting for me. It's a different crowd than I usually speak to, which I can tell because you're all so much better dressed than humanists who have many strong qualities, but fashion is not necessarily one of them. How many of you are like computer science people? A good portion of the crowd. Infoviz people? Sort of. Humanists of various stripes? Yes. My team. Members of my immediate family? Yes. So watch it with the hostile questions because my sister's on my back. So this is a little bit of a different crowd than I usually speak to, and I'm really excited to hear what you make of this, and in particular to see if you want to take it in a really interesting direction, because I think this crowd is uniquely equipped to actually do something about some of the problems I'm going to talk about tonight. Thank you, by the way, to Sophie, to Alard, and to all the organizers for having me here. So without further ado, we're at this cultural moment where data is beautiful. We love it. We love to read books about it, go to workshops and conferences about it, spend our days working with it, go to data visualization speaker series, and it is exciting. I don't think any of us would be here if we didn't find data exciting. We couldn't work with information at this scale before, so the possibilities really do seem near limitless in a certain way. We can see these patterns and trends that we couldn't see before, and we can make them visible in ways that no one has thought of yet. And I know many of you here at USF are doing that exact work. So it's a really cool time to be working with data. And yet, most humanities scholars, for the most part, are not interested in data. So why would anyone not like data? The idea is bizarre. It's like, do you not like facts? Do you not like information? It's a really weird thing to say. And yet, professional humanists have been, I would say not so much hostile to the notion of data as more or less oblivious of it. Let me correct that. Sometimes they're quite hostile. But for the most part, they ignore it completely. They're perfectly happy to go on about their business as though there is no revolution in big data happening right now. And again, that's a little bit of a weird thing for me in particular to say, because digital humanities is in my job title, and I work with data all the time. And those of you who are familiar with academia right now know that digital humanities has become such a catchword right now that grad students are making angry memes about it. So you know you can be big time when they start doing that. Digital humanities, by the way, just refers to the use of digital tools to explore humanities questions, things like mapping, Datavis, topic modeling, natural language processing, applied to humanities materials. And you may have seen some of this. I know someone from Stamen was here last week showing the DH project. Maybe you saw this article in The Atlantic last week. Richard Stowe and Andrew Piper are both people who do digital humanities work. In this particular project, they examined two different sets of novels, one by authors who had completed MFA programs, one by authors who had not, and compared different features of the two to try to determine if MFA programs imparted some unique characteristics to this work. So that was in The Atlantic last week. This is a project I'm kind of fond of. It's kind of low profile, it comes out of UCLA. It's called Troll Finder / Witch Hunter, not to be confused with Elf Yelp, which is by the same two scholars. And basically, it's a way of querying a large body of Scandinavian folktales to understand where the different characters tend to reside. So in this case, we're talking about small kings and their feuds. You could also look at robbers, murderers, and thieves, plague and illnesses, diverse hauntings, and conjurings of revenants. So definitely take a look at that if you get a chance. Another big data project, or big-ish data project, applied to humanities materials. This is the work of Lev Manovich, whom some of you might know. He's interested in analyzing images and audiovisual materials in particular. He's developed a piece of software called Image Plot that will array images according to different features on an X and Y axis. This happens to be a collection of paintings about French Impressionism. And so he's actually arrayed the images themselves rather than dots or pixels. And so if you zoom in close, you can actually see the images. So there's a lot of that kind of work happening right now, whether known to you or not, within universities. And obviously I find it really exciting and cool, or it wouldn't have TH in my job title. But here's an uncomfortable truth about digital humanities scholarship of the kind I just showed you. Nobody cites it. We in digital humanities cite each other and high-five each other, but that's about it. It's very rare that a mainstream humanities scholar will cite this kind of work, and no one has ever produced a piece of DH scholarship that people who don't actively do digital humanities have to cite. And by have to cite, I mean that no one in DH has produced the kind of unequivocally path-breaking work that you just have to cite because it's shaken up your whole discipline. Like the way a historian of photography has to cite Barthes, or a feminist film theorist has to cite Laura Mulvey, or a historian of medicine has to cite Foucault. You would think that humanists working with data would have produced some kind of path-breaking scholarship like that, right? Since after all, this is the first time we've had this amount of data at our disposal. Shouldn't we see wave after wave of groundbreaking new humanities insights coming from all this data? But embarrassingly to those of us who are in digital humanities, we are still waiting, and it's very mysterious. Different people have offered different reasons for this absence of any impression on humanities at large, like maybe regular humanists just don't know about our work, or maybe DH projects aren't being reviewed in mainstream journals, or maybe people who aren't digital just don't know how to look at digital scholarship, or maybe they just can't handle our truth. I mean, maybe, but I suspect the answer is more fundamental than we've wanted to admit. I think that humanities scholars have been indifferent to data-intensive work, not because they don't get it, but because, and this is what I want to argue today, there's an essential mismatch between the traditional goals of humanities scholarship and the way in which evidence must be encoded in order to be called data. But before I launch into this argument for more, I have to back up here a second and just clarify a few terms. We talk about the humanities as though we all know what it is. But in fact, the constellation of disciplines that go by the name humanities haven't been called that for all that long. When the term humanities emerged in the 15th century, it referred largely to the study of ancient Greek and Latin. That is to say, the study of human activities rather than theology, which were your two options at the time. So that's the name humanities. But sometime around World War II, the meaning of the humanities changed so that rather than referring to the classics, the term humanities came to refer to all of the spheres of learning concerned with human culture, which is to say history, literature, languages, philosophy, art, and music, kind of that touchy-feely stuff. And this is more or less the definition that the National Endowment for the Humanities still uses, a sort of grab bag of disciplines that at times actually seems to circle back on itself, So it is literature, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, the history, criticism, and theory of the arts, those aspects of social science which have humanistic content and employ humanistic methods, which what are those? No one has ever said what they are, certainly not this definition. So it's very confusing. We get the sense that it's somehow kind of touchy-feely, but it's never really defined. So the humanities deals with human cultural production. On that we can agree, but does it necessarily include a difference in method as well as in the subject of its scrutiny? That is to say, is the humanities distinct not just because it looks at human cultural production, art, music, literature, but because it looks at it in a special way. It's not clear from the NEH's definition. And if you are anything like me, which is to say kind of a pragmatist, you find this extremely abstract and boring because it's like, who cares what the humanities are? The humanities are like porn. We know it when we see it. I may not be that great at explaining why I do what I do, but other humanists get it, so whatever. Which is why it was such a shock to so many people when this article, Quantitative Analysis of Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books, came out in 2011. Not incidentally in the journal Science, because the authors are scientists, linguists, and mathematicians, and they turn the statistical and computational tools of their disciplines on the products of human culture. Specifically 5 million books from Google's enormous corpus of English language works produced between 1800 and 2000. And they called what they were doing culturomics, which is a play on the word genomics, and argued for the relevance of this new field to a huge panoply of disciplines, including history, gender studies, the history of religion, and linguistics, among many other fields. And so here's a quick example of the kind of argument they made with this strategy. I think they've actually gotten their figures mixed up, but in figure D over here, they argue that the women are gaining ground on the men, as evidenced by the fact that the use of the term women has risen over this period of 200 years. In France, they argue that French feminism made early inroads, but the United States proved to be a more fertile environment for feminism in the long run. Again, as evidenced by the frequency of the terms. So people loved this, or at least the media did, but humanists reacted with almost visceral distaste. I know I did. This was certainly, this was something, but the graphs and charts and statistical takeaways bore more resemblance to trivial pursuit answers than anything that I recognize as humanistic scholarship. We didn't like it, we didn't trust it, we didn't want it, and for all the author's enthusiasm about opening up new windows on human culture, humanists reacted almost to the person by ignoring it and hoping culturomics would just quietly sidle back to the lab that it escaped from. And I just think this picture is funny because the New York Times made the pose with the card catalog. So what was our big problem? Couldn't we just be happy for these enterprising and hardworking scientists? No, we are not happy for them. We are weirded out by them. And I found it really interesting to think about both why this work feels so wrong and alien, but also why we've had such a hard time explaining to other people why it feels so wrong and alien. If you ask most humanists why this work is kind of weird and bad, they'll get a little bit cagey and imprecise. You can actually see it in these quotes from the same New York Times story that I just showed you. Louis Manon says, in general, it's a great thing to have, but obviously some of the claims are a little exaggerated and there was not a single humanist involved. Alan Brinkley says, I could imagine lots of interesting uses, I just don't know enough about what they're trying to do statistically. So these are not happy deeds, these are kind of sick burns in the humanist parlance. But what exactly is troubling Manon Brinkley? you get the sense that they can't quite put their finger on what it is either. And so this is where we find ourselves if we are humanities scholars. The study of human production, human cultural production, stuff like novels and poetry, art and literature, used to be the sole province of humanists because no one else really cared. But with mass digitization of the cultural record, suddenly people from other disciplines do care, and they're excited to turn the methods of their discipline on stuff that used to belong only to humanists. So definitions of humanities scholarship that used to define the field in terms of the stuff it studied are clearly no longer fully sufficient. And at the same time, we haven't really articulated why the way we study this stuff matters as much as the stuff we study. That's what makes possible a situation like culturomics, where scientists can amble on the stage using statistical techniques on the human record and be like, "You're welcome." So now I think is the time for humanists to articulate why some of these technologies don't fully do justice to the things that we value. Otherwise, we're at serious risk of looking, for all any layperson can tell, like incompetent scientists. So what exactly is the source of this humanist unease with data-driven work trained on the human cultural record? And is it worth taking seriously? So sometimes people will say that the problem here is positivism, by which they mean that big data projects like culturomics consider only those phenomena that can be recorded empirically and dismiss all speculation and interpretation. That is to say, the culturomics group has naively mistaken recorded data for reality. And I do think that's an issue here, but I don't think it gets at the entirety of the problem. Because the scientists involved in this project are pretty clear that they intend this work to be a starting point for interpretation, not the end product. In this quote where one of the scientists involved says, the question is, are you willing to examine this data? Kind of cracks me up because the answer is no, absolutely not, we are not interested. So clearly, they're interested in having us interpret this evidence, but this evidence is not of interest to humanists, except under critique. And in any case, humanists of most stripes believe that some kind of ground truth exists somewhere. It's the rare humanities person that believes that absolutely everything is relative, although, they do exist. But most of us use evidence all the time, and we certainly believe that evidence can prove an argument wrong or right. Otherwise, we wouldn't spend so much time in archives. It's just that the culturomics data was clearly the wrong evidence for us. So is the problem something else? Well, humanists tend to prize close reading, by which I mean carefully interpreting smaller pieces of evidence in order to make arguments. And people often raise this fondness for close reading as a possible reason that humanists haven't taken to big data projects. But again, I think this is important, but not the entirety of the issue, because close reading is a method for the performance of humanities scholarship, not the scholarship itself. And it's never been the only tool that humanists use. We look at stuff at scale all the time. Cultural poetics, for example, is a way of splitting many pieces of evidence. We just don't like doing this interpretive work via data sets. So a preference for close reading and an aversion to positivism are certainly important, but I don't think they tell you the entire story. The real problem, I think, lies with some fundamental attributes of data itself, data as it's created and used. And when I say data here, I'm using it in a particular way, to mean structured information that's computationally tractable. It can exist in a lot of different forms, but data, as most people use the term, as I'm using it here, is information that is divided into discrete, manipulable parts and made actionable in some way by a computer. In an article for the LA Review of Books, Stephen Marsh proclaimed that literature is not data. And of course he's right, literature is not data. But the problem is, as my friend Natalia Ciceri tweeted, nothing in the world is data until it's structured and encoded. data does not exist in the wild. It's created through interpretation and organization of sources and phenomena. So the books the culturomics guys were mining were not data until they were organized, classified, structured, and made searchable. But so while I think Marsh's statement is a little confused, I think that he expresses something really important, which is that humanists have a problem with the very notion of data itself. So in what follows, I'm going to attempt, this is the first time I've tried to do this, so get ready, to articulate several problems that data poses for the humanist. Some of these are bigger problems, some of them are smaller, but I think together they help us to understand why digital humanities hasn't extended farther than it has, and point to some avenues that we might pursue, I guess by we I mean you, together with us, if we do persist in attempting to work with data in humanistic ways. So first, demarcation. The boundaries of structured data must be demarcated in some way. Information cannot exist as an undifferentiated mass if we're going to perform computational operations on it. And yet, humanists tend not to see events, objects, or even people as cleanly disconnected from one another. So one of the culturomics diagrams, just for example, gave us information about the dates on which various inventions came into being, and then the relative frequency of the use of those names for those inventions. But the very word invention tends to make historians squirm, because it suggests that objects are cut cleanly from whole cloth. They weren't here, and then they were here. But we see individual technologies as emerging from constellations of forces, not as suddenly appearing like thunderbolts. And in fact, we tend not to think of various pieces of technology as separate in and of themselves. The notion of remediation, which is very important for media scholars, suggests that technologies are always built into the technologies that succeed them. In the way, for example, that cinema swallowed vaudeville and television swallowed cinema, and on and on and on. They're not really separate, they're connected. Or to give you another example, a database I'm working on now requires me to construct separate fields for film screenwriters, photographers, and directors, which is fine, that makes sense for Golden Age Hollywood, but that same separation of roles doesn't hold true for the early silent era, when the notion of a director didn't even really exist. And yet, somehow I need to track these roles over time, but they're not the same thing, so it's very confusing. This closely related issue, parameterization, has to do with whether one data point can sensibly be measured against another. So when is it okay to say that one thing is equivalent to another thing, or precedes another thing, or outweighs another thing? We need some sort of standardized scale of measurement. To give one example, we know when we think about the way that we experience our lives, that time doesn't operate the same way at all times. When you're experiencing something really uncomfortable, time tends to stretch on forever, while this talk, on the other hand, is just flashing before your eyes and enjoyable, and you just can't bear the thought of it ending. So we register time in different ways, but in order to place it on some kind of scale, we need to apply standardized measurements to it. And this feels strange to people who are interested in the particularity of experiences, because it seems to deny that different people can experience the same thing in different ways. And you can see some of this weirdness in action with this digital humanities project, Digital Harlem, about 2012, which claims to display the everyday lives of people who lived in Harlem between 1915 and 1930. I mean, maybe, but for whom does a card game occupy the same space as an assault? These two experiences are not equivalent, and yet they have to be made to fit the same order of thing if they're going to be jointly displayed on a map. The term ontology can mean many different things. In philosophy, it often refers to the basic essence of something, while in computer science, ontology, as I'm sure many of you know, refers to the way that you organize entities to make a data model. But I kind of like this confusing aspect of this word because I think it gets at an important facet of the term. The way we divide the world into categories, of course, does express something fundamental about the way we experience the world. And one person's ontology often won't make sense for another person. Databases are designed to stabilize relationships, otherwise we can't retrieve information from them. But when humanists think about the way things are connected to each other, they're trained to be really attentive to the way these connections change depending on who's doing the looking. And an example of the way this is played out in the real world is the case of indigenous communities trying to make their cultural materials retrievable and findable in libraries and archives. Here's an indigenous librarian saying, have you ever noticed how American Indians are treated in Library of Congress cataloging? In both obvious and subtle ways, American Indians are treated as remnants of the past. Because for the most part, indigenous materials are classed under antiquities, which makes sense from a certain point of view. One might argue it makes sense from the point of view of a colonial administrator, but it makes very little sense if you're an indigenous person trying to decide whether a musical instrument should be classed under the name of her tribe or under the name of her of an art object, for example. So in response, we've seen a good number of alternate classification schemas arising from indigenous communities themselves. The Brian Deere classification system is probably the best known of these. So ontology is sort of the ground you walk on, the air you breathe. It's the basic assumptions that you make about how you should understand the world. Scientists have many disputes about many things, but they also tend to have a shared understanding about the terms of the debate. But humanists love to change the terms of the debate. It's our specialty. And it's not just because we're sneaky, but because we think it's important, if you're representing human culture, to understand that not every human experiences the world in the same way. So standardized models of the world become very troublesome for us. In the sciences, it's become really important for repositories to collect not just scientific studies, but the underlying data itself, so that scientists can replicate experiments and thus check their veracity. It's one great benefit of well-structured and described data, this ability to independently verify results. But this logic is completely unintelligible to humanities scholars because we would never expect two different people to look at the same book or film and come to the same conclusion about what it means, ever. It's not that interpretation is so personal, although it kind of is, so much as that the interpretation is the work. It's very rare that someone disputes what you in fact, that you in fact saw what you said you saw, just that you were wrong in the meaning you ascribed to the thing you saw. So the very idea that one person's research might replicate another's suggests to the humanities scholar that the person asking us to replicate our work just fundamentally doesn't understand what we're doing. So all of these operations that I've just described are performed under the sign of categorization, which is what I want to argue is at the heart of this humanistic refusal to embrace data. You'll probably understand immediately that categorization is at the very essence of any attempt to create data. But I'll explain briefly what I mean, just so that everyone's on the same page. The world as it exists is a cacophony of phenomena, none of which is inherently categorized in any particular way. So in order to turn this mess into computable data, we need to identify those parts of any object or phenomenon that are meaningful to us, and then give labels to those attributes. For example, I could be classified as a person, a woman, a scholar, a digital humanist, a mother, a brown-haired person, or any number of other things depending on what your relationship is to me, or how you feel about me, or what you're interested in. And the label we pick depends on the kind of thing we're interested in counting. And we all have to standardize those labels in order for them to be at all meaningful. I may like to call myself a woman, you may like woman with a Y, but in order to have any kind of meaningful category to represent the idea of womanhood, we need to standardize the label we're using. If we don't categorize, we can't count or retrieve, and if we can't count or retrieve, we can't visualize. I've been doing some work with linked data recently, and it's been fascinating to see how this need to standardize plays out in a lot of linked open data schemas. Most of them actually have URIs for male, female, and gender not known. So that's kind of an extreme example of labeling. We may believe, moving through the world, that gender is fluid and contradictory and multivalent, but DBpedia, unknown to most people, has a single authority page for male or female where this stuff is non-negotiable. It's weird that these are all the entities referring to the same gender description of the male. Here's another example from a project that I like from the National Geographic online called The Changing Face of America. And it arrays in front of you the faces of many people whose race is visually kind of hard to determine and sort of tacitly asking you to classify them. And when you click on any individual person's picture, oh, it got cut off here, so I'll just tell you, you get their photo, their name, and their self-identification, which in this case is African American and German/multiracial, versus the census box checked, which in this case is black. So you really do start to understand the difference between the very complicated ways in which we understand our identities and the ways in which we're forced to kind of cage those identities into data in order to make them intelligible at scale. And yet, if we're going to work with data in any meaningful way, we have to do stuff like that, like creating authorities for gender and race, because we need to be able to aggregate and disaggregate data in order to make it anything other than a whole bunch of individual cells in a table. So categorization is famously and fascinatingly problematic, but categorization in and of itself isn't, I don't think, the problem for humanists. We classify all the time. Anyone who thinks about anything at scale has to do that. Human beings in general do that. We talk about World War II as a thing, for example, or the antebellum era, or black people and white people. You could even argue that humanists spend most of our time classifying. This is what race is, or this is what reading is, or this is what a film is. The problem, I think, comes when an argument depends on the application of ahistorical categories across disparate swaths of time and space, or disparate communities of people. Which is to say, when an argument depends on what we're calling data at scale. And this is when humanists get really itchy and uncomfortable. Because really good humanities scholarship doesn't take existing categories as its raw material. The whole point is to break existing categories by making new and unexpected connections. And this, I think, is what humanities scholarship tends to do, or at least what it aspires to do. We use evidence and arguments not to sharpen our understanding of existing categories and ontologies, but to break them and create new ones. And the most powerful humanities scholarship is that which breaks the categories that seem absolutely the most natural to us. So natural that it wouldn't even occur to us to question them. Things like man, woman, black, white, human, non-human. We use evidence, definitely, but to build new ontological frameworks, not for the most part to fill in gaps in a timeline. And I think this is partly where the culturomic stuff went wrong. I think they had an erroneous idea of what humanists do, that we somehow all have a timeline that we're working with, and our job is to just kind of fill in the gaps in better and better detail. But that's not actually what we do. We all are working with different models of the world and arguing about what makes the most sense. So I think that's why the culturomic stuff seems weird to us, because it assumes that these categories, which are the very thing we're trying to question, have some kind of salience across time and space. It's a display of virtuosity that's actually completely irrelevant to anything we're actually concerned about. So I think all of this probably makes it sound as though I hate data, but that is actually not the case. I find it fascinating and work with it all the time. It's just that I think that those of us who are interested in using data for humanistic work need to think about different methods for working with it, and very possibly need visual rhetorics. Data visualization methodologies now are designed to maximize legibility and speed up comprehension. If it takes you too long to get it, the visualization is not working. We're trained to eliminate chart junk and any other visual information that interferes with rapid comprehension of what the data can tell us. But that speedy comprehensiveness comes at a cost because it trains us to look for meaning in the data itself rather than to understand data as an interpretation of reality, or as one possible interpretation of reality. I do not have anything close to all the answers, but the modes of visualization I found most intriguing for humanities research are those that evince what I think of as an agonistic or even agonized relation to data. This mode of visualization that acknowledges that the data certainly tells you something, but doesn't tell you everything. And many of the data visualizations that I like best point out gaps and complexities within the archives themselves. That is, they affirm the constructiveness of the archive and the data, not the essential reality of the data. This is a project by Lauren Klein, a scholar who's at Georgia Tech, and she was interested in James Hemings, who was Thomas Jefferson's enslaved chef. And in looking through the archives of Thomas Jefferson for correspondence from James Hemings, she was struck by the fact that the archive never collected any of James Hemings' letters, because he was not a person of interest to the archivists. So instead of visualizing James Hemings' own letters, she visualized every letter to and from Thomas Jefferson that mentioned James Hemings. So in these arcs, in this arc diagram, you get kind of a ghostly sense of Hemings himself as existing as an object that is traded among colonial administrators. This is a project by Tim Sherratt, who works in Australia. He was interested in archival documents relating to Chinese immigration to Australia, particularly in the face of really restrictive immigration policies. And it struck him, looking at the archive, that if people could just kind of see the people who were being discussed in these letters, they might have a different understanding of how immigration progressed in Australia. So using facial recognition, he pulled from all these archival documents the faces of the letter writers themselves, so that the faces become the interface into the archival documents. Recently, I've been interested in the Maori subject headings, which is an alternate system for classifying objects devised by a working group consisting of Maori people and library and information science professionals. So this Maori subject headings project was designed to accommodate Maori knowledge, which isn't always organized according to the same principles as the Library of Congress subject headings, which are like the main classification system that most libraries and archives use. For example, the Library of Congress subject headings classify spacecraft as a type of rocketry, which itself is a type of aeronautics, which itself is classified under communication and traffic. The Maori subject headings list a spaceship as a subcategory of canoe, waka, which can mean canoe, but also a conveyance in general, and much more than that, since the Maori were legendary navigators. So that's what a waka tea, spacecraft, is, according to Maori knowledge. It's a canoe for the stars, a waka for the stars. So Maori subject headings are interesting for a whole lot of different reasons, including the way in which they're encoded. They have to be made interoperable with Library of Congress subject headings. So they're encoded as nested structures using XML, even though Maori knowledge doesn't necessarily work that way. It doesn't really nest itself in quite the same way that Library of Congress subject headings demand. So the guiding metaphor that the Maori working group uses is tuku-tuku, which is a kind of weaving in which one person stands on one side of the loom and the other person stands on the other. And the idea is that the person making Maori knowledge fit North American knowledge structures is engaged in this kind of back and forth, this push and pull between what makes the most sense for Maori epistemology and what makes the most sense for the system that has to accommodate this knowledge. And I recently had the chance to think through the problem of visualizing these Maori subject headings with a group of other DH people and Datavis people at a gathering at Georgia Tech a few weeks ago. And our question was, could we possibly find a way to visualize this information in a way that provided the viewer with a sense of Maori knowledge organization? And we thought about the Library of Congress Galaxy, which is really cool. It's a really cool visualization produced at Stanford for the Library of Congress. And it's a way to navigate through Library of Congress subject headings as a kind of galaxy. So, you know, each of these stands for one particular kind of heading, and it's attached to many different nodes related to the things that it classifies. And it makes perfect sense for the kind of knowledge that the Library of Congress subject headings are: hierarchical, nested, universalizing. But one of the benefits of this galaxy is that you can stand on one planet and get a sense of every other planet from where you're standing. That's why it's such a visually effective rhetoric. But that's not really how Maori knowledge works. You traverse through it from person to person, and when she thinks you're ready, she gives you a little bit more information. So what would that experience of knowledge look like as a method of visualizing data? So we started just by visualizing the XML subject headings as kind of the kind of thing that they most naturally were, which was a force-directed graph, knowing at the same time that this wasn't the final form we wanted to put it in. And the prototype we emerged with was an attempt to capture that experience of slowly piecing together information rather than apprehending it all in one glance. The idea is that you'd start at the left, and then slowly, piece by piece, one bit of knowledge unlocks the next, and over time, you pick out a pattern. So it's just an idea, and it's something we're still thinking through, but this problem of finding modes of visualization that fit the epistemology of the phenomenon you're trying to depict really interests me. And this notion of tuku-tuku, this back and forth and push and pull, really interests me too. So I don't think that humanists can go back to doing what we've always done. All of our stuff is digitized now, and someone's going to compute on it. And if you can't compute on something, I think it's really unrealistic to expect people not to. And unless we're very specific about what humanists do that's different from what other scholars do, we're just going to look like bad scientists. So I'm really interested going forward in finding ways to think about and represent data that are more congenial to the knowledge systems that produce them. That means I think devising different, more fluid and subtle data classification systems, but also forms of visualization that can express multiple perspectives, changing timescales, and multiple localities. I think that we might have to actually invent new visual rhetorics to represent these registers, since our current repertoire is so limited and concrete. I think that was why I was so interested in coming to talk to you today, because I know it's something that you think about a lot, these modes of different visual rhetorics and how to best do justice to the information you're considering. And so I hope that you find these problems not so much overwhelming, as exciting and fun and interesting as I do. And I would love to talk to you about collaborating in the future. So thank you very much. So we have time for questions?
Hold the microphones for questions. And you also put towards a lot of my discomfort, at what Dave must be doing. I think you mentioned that you, as I was waiting here tonight, I read something you wrote in July about Google Maps. Not only the flattening that building, you register that reminds one is like building empire ways. So I think more about that, but I guess my question is like, as it does seem to go the opposite. Rather than breaking down categories, reinforces and simplifies it. But if data is that kind of wild, it could be provocative, and a departure. So you must be thinking of some ways, like the Maori project and others. Do you have another topic you could talk about that you're working on?
Not at the moment. I think the Maori thing is what I'm working on right now. And I think that we're really at the very beginning of developing visual rhetorics to express different kinds of knowledge. I think that this kind of visualization doesn't really exist yet, which is why I think it's fun and interesting. I think there are examples of people who are interested in this and doing really good work. Johanna Drucker at UCLA, David Kim at Occidental College, and Catherine Ignacio at Emerson. I think all of us are interested in kind of embedding different philosophies of knowledge into data visualization, but it's an open field. Really, there's a lot of room for people to come up with new ideas.
Have you seen work where they're taking some of these graphs of the Datavis examples that you critique and attempting to just call out all those reasons why this categorization is problematic? Like a diagram on top of it, call outs?
I think the person who does that best is Johanna Drucker in her book Graphesis, published by Harvard a couple of years ago. So Johanna is just she's kind of a take no prisoners kind of person, and so she'll kind of take you through all the rhetorical flaws in any visualization, which are different from the flaws that Tuft might point out, right? Or different from what Nathan Yao might find as a problem in an information visualization. So she's got some great examples in there. But most of us are pretty nice to each other in the digital humanities world. We have a reputation for being nice. So there hasn't been the kind of robust critique that some might argue is necessary.
Hi, thanks for coming. With regard to, I respect the pushback that you're communicating from humanities because of the inclination to disrupt taxonomy, etc. But when you think about the process of research, it's naturally broken down into several stages. And the first stage are the case studies where you define the problem and you define the metrics. Have you endeavored in coordinating some respected notable figures from the humanities to participate in that stage, where they define metrics, etc., and then you hand it off to people to do the analytics, and then it comes back, and then the product is not considered to be an answer, but instead a tool.
Yeah, I love that. I love that model. I think you're right. I think that there's a lot of possibility in that sort of pipeline you're suggesting. So I guess I would point out just a couple places where that model has surprised us. One of them has been that if you design your own beautiful, completely adequate and elegant data schema for sources, it's shocking how much it doesn't make sense to anyone else. So it becomes a very kind of specific and contained hermetic universe. The other is that we often find ourselves, because of the tools that are available for us to visualize and describe information, resorting just by virtue of the kinds of tools we have to use to visualizing with known legible forms and rhetorics. Which is why I think it's so exciting that people who can actually innovate on that are here and interested in talking about it.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk, Miriam. Just to piggyback on it a little bit, you can see kind of a two-pronged problem in the sense that both there's the resistance to use categories that are stable by humanists, and then there's also the fact that we tend to map things in ways that we're familiar to map them. As you kind of suggested with Google, we all use these maps. Do we really want to make the past look like the maps that we use on our iPhone to find a restaurant or something like that? Should this all look the same? And so it really is incumbent on people to find new interactive and tangential strategies. So pushing on that, do we see interesting ways of interactive mapping with the past that would really exploit the kind of pushback and navigation you were talking about? And I was just wondering if you had any suggestion about that, and also maybe any ideas of using the older maps in a way to make the older maps seen in different ways that could create a way of exploring that. And I guess I'm thinking partly of the stuff that has been done with georectification and things like that, but also with other more interesting kind of exploring the past as a foreign country.
Yeah, there's some really interesting experiments with different modes of mapping, none of which I have like immediately to hand, but one experiment that I thought was really interesting has to do with Japanese mapping from the 1500s and 1600s. When Japanese maps, you may have seen them, they from this period are not Mercator projections, instead they're huge. They're like the size of a floor mat, and you're meant to look at them all together in a room with different people sitting around them. So the projection is actually extremely different from the Mercator projection. So we've experimented a little bit at UCLA with geo-rectifying those maps onto the Mercator projection, which has kind of worked and kind of not worked. That's one thing we've been interested in. There's a really interesting project that attempts to kind of understand the Greek world according to the methods of mapping that would have been current at the time. And I'm blanking on the name of the author, but I can certainly dig it up at some point and send it to you. But as I said, a lot of these experiments are still really nascent. They haven't advanced very far yet.
Okay, great. Let's thank Christina.